When I first moved into Brookline Row Apartments, I believed I was finally stepping into adulthood. I was 21, halfway through college, and tired of living under rules that were never mine. Brookline Row wasn't fancy, but it was affordable, quiet, and close to campus. The building was old, thin walls, narrow hallways, and doors that creaked no matter how gently you closed them. Still, it felt safe. Most tenants were students or young professionals. Everyone minded their own business. You passed people in the hallway, exchanged polite nods, and moved on. No drama, no trouble. That's why Margaret Hales, my neighbor across the hall, stood out. She was in her mid-50s, maybe older. Her hair was always tied back neatly, streaked with gray. She wore the same types of clothes: plain sweaters, long skirts, sensible shoes. She never looked messy, but she never looked comfortable either. Her posture was stiff, like she was always bracing herself. The first few days, we barely interacted. I saw her leaving her apartment occasionally, always alone, always quiet. She didn't carry groceries. She didn't have visitors. She didn't even seem to have a routine. At least, that's what I thought. The first strange thing I noticed was her timing. Every weekday morning, I left for class at exactly 8:10 a.m. Without fail, her door opened just seconds before mine. She never walked beside me. She never spoke. She simply stood in her doorway, adjusting her bag or staring at the floor, as if she had been waiting for something. If I left at 8:05, she wasn't there. If I left at 8:20, she wasn't there. Only at 8:10. At first, I brushed it off as coincidence. Buildings like this had patterns. People followed schedules. It didn't mean anything. Then she started talking to me. The first time, it was harmless. "Long day ahead," she said softly as I locked my door. I nodded politely. "Yeah, always is." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. A few days later, she surprised me again. "You stayed up late last night," she said, not as a question. I paused. "Oh yeah? Exams." She nodded slowly, like she already knew the answer. "You should sleep more. You're sharper when you do." That sentence stayed with me. I hadn't told her anything about my schedule. And yet, she spoke with certainty, not curiosity. Still, I told myself I was being paranoid. Things escalated slowly, quietly. The worst things usually do. I began noticing small changes inside my apartment. My desk chair would be slightly moved. My bathroom mirror sometimes had faint writing on it after showers, my name, written with a finger through steam. Once, I came home to find my groceries rearranged. Nothing was missing. Nothing was broken. Just moved. I checked my locks. Everything was secure. I stopped inviting friends over. Not because I was afraid, but because I couldn't explain why I felt watched. Then the notes started appearing. Small slips of paper slid under my door. "Lock your window before sleeping. You forgot your charger again. You eat too much instant food." Each note was written in neat, careful handwriting. I never confronted her. Part of me didn't want confirmation. Another part feared what might happen if I did. The breaking point came one Sunday afternoon. I returned from the library and found a thick envelope resting against my door. No stamp, no address, just my name written neatly on the front. Inside were 8 handwritten pages. Every page described my life in detail. What time I woke up, how long I showered, who I called at night, which lights I left on, the exact position of my bed. The final page ended with a sentence that made my hands shake. "I watch because someone has to keep you safe." I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called the police. They searched the building thoroughly. At first, they found nothing. Then one officer noticed something odd behind a cabinet in Margaret's apartment. A small hole, perfectly drilled. It led directly into my bedroom wall. Margaret didn't resist when they took her in. She didn't deny anything either. She simply said, calmly, that she had been protecting me. Later, I learned the truth. She had lived alone for years. No family, no visitors. She had developed an obsession with routine, control, and surveillance. The building's poor maintenance had given her access she should never have had. She wasn't arrested. She was taken for psychiatric evaluation. I moved out 2 weeks later. Even now, years later, I still close my curtains before turning on the lights. Not because I fear strangers, but because sometimes the people closest to us are the ones watching most carefully. When my wife, Elaine, and I moved into Willow Creek Lane, we believed we had finally found peace. Quiet street. Families who waved politely and minded their own business. Low traffic. Lawns neatly kept, Mailboxes aligned like little soldiers along the sidewalk. It was exactly the kind of neighborhood you see in magazines, perfect and safe. Next door, the house belonged to Caleb and Nora Whitman. They seemed perfect too. Too perfect. At first, everything about them made you feel calm. They mowed the lawn at the exact same time every week. Lights went off simultaneously at night. Nora smiled constantly. Caleb never raised his voice. They always answered our polite waves. Neighbors who watched them from across the street would see nothing unusual. But perfection, I would later learn, can hide darkness. It started slowly, subtly. At first, we heard nothing through the thin walls that separated our homes. Sometimes, at night, we thought we heard a tap, a soft shuffle. We shrugged it off, maybe a branch scraping the siding, maybe a cat. The sounds became more frequent, more deliberate. I began noticing odd patterns in their routine. Every morning, Caleb left for work precisely at 7:32 a.m. Not 7:30, not 7:35, 7:32. He drove the same route, wearing the same dark suit. Nora left exactly 15 minutes later, always in a different car than his, sometimes following behind him, sometimes not. Yet, they never interacted with anyone outside the house. They did not invite guests. No one ever saw deliveries. No newspapers. No packages. Nothing. It unnerved me, but the real warning signs came later. One day, while tending to our garden, I noticed faint bruises on Caleb's wrists. At first, I thought he had been clumsy. He was tall, lanky, and awkward with tools. But over the next few weeks, I saw him limp slightly. Small cuts on his knuckles. Again, I assumed accidents. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. But Elaine began noticing the same things, and she felt uneasy too. The first alarming incident occurred late one evening. I was inside, reading, when I saw Caleb at his window, pacing nervously. He wasn't alone in the room, but no one else appeared in the house. His hands trembled. He looked out at nothing, muttering under his breath. I assumed he was arguing with Nora, but she never raised her voice. She never appeared agitated. She was calm, eerily calm. The calm was worse than anger. Over the next few months, I noticed patterns that didn't make sense. Caleb would step outside for exercise, only to return pale, sweaty, and sometimes bleeding from scratches on his arms. Nora was always inside, watching. Nothing else happened. No yelling, no physical confrontations. But the fear in Caleb's eyes told the whole story. Then came the night that confirmed everything. It was a Tuesday, around 11:45 p.m. Elaine and I were watching TV when we heard it. A sharp, repeated tapping at their front door. Not knocking. Tapping, like a metronome. Then silence. Seconds later, the tap resumed. We assumed a late visitor, perhaps a delivery, and dismissed it. But the tapping continued for hours, perfectly rhythmic. At 2:13 a.m., we could hear muffled sounds, whispers, quick footsteps, and then, almost imperceptibly, Caleb crying softly. The next morning, I noticed something strange in the Whitmans' yard. Footprints in the flower beds leading to a side window. Caleb's shoes were inside, but the prints suggested someone had been outside, unseen. Over time, their house revealed more secrets. We learned Caleb had been isolated for years. Nora had carefully severed his connections with family and friends. She monitored his phone, controlled his finances, controlled what he ate, when he slept, and even how he exercised. It wasn't violent in the traditional sense. No punches, no shouting, just absolute control. The final confrontation happened one evening when Caleb slipped out of the house without Nora noticing. He came to our porch, exhausted, bruised, and terrified. He whispered everything between breaths. How she monitored him, how she punished small mistakes with isolation or fear, how every action in the house was dictated by her. He had finally reached a breaking point. Police were called immediately. When they investigated, Nora appeared calm, too calm. She answered questions without agitation. No screaming, no resistance. The house was immaculate. Evidence was subtle but damning. Surveillance cameras hidden throughout the rooms, a log of Caleb's every movement, and audio recordings detailing his conversations. Caleb survived, though the psychological damage lingered. Nora was arrested and taken into custody, evaluated for psychiatric treatment. Their house remains empty to this day. Every time we drive by, I feel a subtle unease. Even empty, even quiet, the place emanates control, obsession, and fear. It reminds me that danger doesn't always announce itself with noise or chaos. Sometimes it arrives silently, hidden behind perfection, routine, and smiles that never reach the eyes. I work from home. My office is on the third floor of my apartment, with a large window overlooking the street below. I thought I knew my neighborhood. Quiet, uneventful, predictable. Families walking dogs, children riding bikes, neighbors chatting politely. Nothing extraordinary. Until Elliot Moore moved in next door. At first, he seemed normal. Mid-30s, neat, introverted, rarely leaving his apartment during the day. Occasionally, I'd hear him speak in the hallway when collecting mail or taking out trash. Polite, reserved, a man who valued solitude. That was my first mistake, assuming normalcy. The first oddity came a few weeks after he moved in. I began hearing voices through the wall separating our apartments. Faint at first, barely discernible. I assumed it was TV noise or someone on a conference call. But the more I listened, the more it became clear that it wasn't random. Elliot was practicing conversations. I could hear him speaking slowly, repeating sentences, testing intonations. Sometimes it sounded like he was arguing, apologizing, or laughing with someone. But there was no one on the other side of the wall. Every time I left my office, the apartment seemed empty. Days turned into weeks, and the behavior escalated. Elliot's conversations became eerily specific. He would mimic voices I had only spoken to on the phone. I could recognize the cadence of my own words, the way I said thank you or good night, and he would repeat them aloud in different contexts, as though rehearsing a response for someone he had never met. I tried to ignore it. At first, it felt like harmless eccentricity. People are quirky. People are lonely. Maybe he was practicing public speaking, but his obsession was methodical. He spent hours repeating my exact words, my tone, my pauses, even private phrases I never spoke aloud outside my home. One night, the strangest thing happened. I had a Zoom call with my sister, discussing family matters. About 10 minutes in, I heard a soft knock on the shared wall. Then, a whisper mimicking my own voice. Don't forget to ask about Mom's doctor. I froze. I hadn't mentioned that detail to anyone else. The words were specific, accurate, spoken by someone else, yet in my exact tone. I knew then it wasn't harmless. The next day, I called the police. They arrived and investigated. Elliot's apartment appeared normal from the outside. The interior looked tidy, minimalistic. But hidden throughout the walls and vents were microphones and small speakers, all connected to a recording system he had installed months prior. He had been eavesdropping on his neighbors, gathering snippets of conversations to practice them later, constructing imaginary interactions to simulate relationships he didn't have. The strangest part? He didn't resist arrest. He simply smiled, calm and composed, as if nothing had happened. He told officers he didn't intend to hurt anyone. He just wanted companionship, simulated, rehearsed, controlled. Authorities determined Elliot suffered from severe social isolation and obsessive-compulsive tendencies. He was taken for psychiatric evaluation, and strict no-contact orders were placed. I moved my office to the far side of my apartment, added soundproofing, and installed cameras. Even now, years later, I am hyper-aware of silence. Sometimes, I still hear echoes in the walls. Not voices, not sounds, just the feeling of being watched. The lesson was clear. Danger doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it is methodical, invisible, and patient.